So Donald Trump has been claiming that mail-in voting is a plot to steal elections. And Fox News host Chris Wallace stepped up to correct the record here.
Well, yeah, I've done some deep dive in it. There really is no record of massive fraud or even serious fraud from mail-in voting. It's being carried out in Republican states. It's being carried out in Democratic states. There's no indication that mail-in voting as opposed to in-person voting tends to favor one party over another. If anything, it tends to favor Republicans because the people, now we're talking about outside a pandemic, who historically have tended to vote most often by mail are elderly people, people over 65, and they tend to vote more Republican than Democratic. So, have there been some cases? Yes. And there's an issue sometimes with what's called vote harvesting, where instead of mailing in your ballot, that you'll get people who will go into a community and vacuum up, collect all the ballots, say they're going to take them in. And then the danger, of course, is that they will discard the ballots from neighborhoods that they think are going to vote for the other party. We've seen that in North Carolina. There was a big case involving a Republican who did that, and it helped a Republican win the election. It was so serious they had to have a new election. It's happened sometimes in California. But when people get their ballots and mail them in themselves, no history of fraud at all.
Donald Trump and the Republicans' propaganda outlet has just turned on Donald Trump on this issue because it's one that's so ridiculous and so over the top that they couldn't even bring themselves to play defense. So Trump keeps claiming that, no, we're not going to do mail-in voting. We're not going to do mail-in voting because that's all fraud. That's all fraud. You can't trust those elections. And by the way, Trump even made that point at a time when there was a special election and the Republicans won. He says in one sentence, it's all a Democratic plot to steal the election. And then the next sentence, he's like, and we just had a mail-in election and the Republican won. Like Chris Wallace says, if it helps anybody, it tends to help Republicans because older voters do the mail-in voting and older voters lean to the right, generally speaking. So it's not like, I don't know where they get these ideas from, but once he gets an idea in his head, he never lets it go and he runs with it. And it's so obnoxious and it's so absurd and it's so ridiculous. I'm not saying our elections are perfect. They're definitely not. But here's what I would say. We should absolutely ban private companies, using private companies for any sort of machines that count the votes or collect the ballots or whatever it may be. Because that's the real problem. The problem is when you have private companies that have ties to certain politicians, you're using their computers, you're using their products, and that is not objective, that's not fair, that's not an independent third party looking at it, that is somebody with a conflict of interest and using their product for it. That's my concern when it comes to our elections. That's my concern. But he's talking about how mail-in votes are a fraud. No, Donald, the reason why we want to move towards a mail-in voting system, the reason why we want to do that is because there's a pandemic. And it's a way to make sure people are safe. Because again, when you think of the worst kinds of places to be in for a pandemic, it's enclosed areas, close quarters with other people, like on top of other people. That's exactly what you get when you go to vote. You get lines, you get people right next to each other, you get one person coughs, you're going to infect a dozen people or more. At least, because then you have people continually walking in and out of the room and they could, breathe it in or whatever. It's so obvious that we need to do something to have an election that doesn't involve all going into a small place where one person with COVID can infect everybody. And so that's why people want to do, mail-in voting. And again, Trump even admits, these Republicans won in the mail-in voting thing. But then he says it's all a Democratic plot to steal the election. Believe me, I do not trust the Democrats. I don't trust the Republicans. I don't trust any of these people making objective decisions. But what I can guarantee you is mail-in voting in and of itself is not a problem. As Chris Wallace laid out there, the real issue is what's called vote harvesting. I can't talk today. Vote harvesting, which is the idea that, okay, you go ahead and you do your ballot, but then there's groups, political groups, that go around and collect all the ballots. And then they submit them. Well, hold on. Now, that person has a conflict of interest. If you have mail-in voting where nobody goes around and collects the ballots and the people handle it themselves, I just voted, now I will deliver it, like that's okay. But as soon as you get groups, let's harvest all the ballots, let's get the ballots, then it's sketchy because you don't know what they're doing, you don't know what's going on, you don't know who they have an allegiance to, then it gets sketchy. But all you have to do is ban vote harvesting, but allow mail-in elections. That's it. Then you're good. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm here in New York. I'm not trying to go into an area where 1,000 people have been, and if one of them has COVID, the rest of us get COVID. I'm not trying to do that. So, but his theories, man, he gets an idea in his head. Mail-in voting is corrupt, full of fraud, and he just runs with it. Well, even Chris Wallace has broken it down. That's simply not true. You want to talk about a fraud, it's trying to exclude voters from exercising their rights, like all of voter ID. You've had Republicans who've admitted that in the past. Like, yeah, we're doing voter ID because we want to stop poor people from voting when they don't have the ID. They didn't get the ID, so block poor people from voting, and that's how we do it. So that's the real concern. Voter ID is the real concern. Using private companies, products, that's the real concern. I'm not concerned about mail-in voting. I trust mail-in voting about as much as I trust all other forms of elections in the United States, which is not so much, but it's no worse than any other kind of voting that we do.